Anne Applebaum joins me now. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. She's a staff writer for The Atlantic. She's the author of several important books, including Autocracy, Inc., Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Anne, thank you for being with us. You know, after the elections in Hungary last Sunday, I knew I wanted to talk about this week, and there was a lot of stuff written about it, but I needed to see what you would write about this because you really follow this so closely. And in your piece, you outline the challenges that the opponent, Orban's opponent, Peter Magyar, faced and the roadmap that he took to victory. Can you just take us through that? Because I think it'll sound familiar to a lot of Americans right now.
So Orban's opponent, Peter Magyar, faced a really unusual set of challenges. Not only did he have to overcome a media system in which the government controls 90% of newspapers, television, all media, an election system that was rigged to favor the countryside as opposed to the city where many supporters of liberal movements had traditionally lived. He had to suffer personal attacks. A girlfriend of his was recruited by the ruling party to spy on him and make tapes of him. He personally experienced, constant harassment. His party had their data hacked and placed online, I think also with the objective of the idea was to get people to harass members of the party. So this was not a normal election at all. And he really only won thanks to a very grassroots campaign in which he, knowing the advantage that was given to the countryside, he spent a lot of time going round and round rural villages and towns, meeting people and building connections to people all over the country. Since he wasn't able to reach people through media, the idea was for him and his team to reach people in reality. And of course, that was, it's an old idea in politics, but this time it was used as a way of overcoming, a near full control of the state by one political party.
One of the things that I was curious about, because when we listen to people who were being interviewed in Hungary, it sounds like Americans. They're concerned about the economy. They're concerned about, where the ruling party had gone off track. There was certainly a lot of concern on the grassroots, particularly in the cities, in places like Budapest, about corruption and oligarchy and that sort of stuff. How did Magyar thread that needle? How much of it is about kitchen table issues versus your government's out of control?
I think what he tried to do was to link them. In other words, your economic problems are related to the fact that your government is stealing from you. The ruling party is corrupt. They have close connections to a small group of companies who get an unusual number of government contracts. Your schools and your hospitals are getting worse and weaker because they are stealing from you. And so, he managed to reach people even outside of what you would think of as liberal circles or opposition circles or highly educated circles, precisely because he made this link. And I think after 16 years of Orban's rule, I think people could see it. I mean, it was very evident to people who live even in the countryside that the system of distributing government money was unfair, that it was biased in favor of people who were close to the ruling party, that you needed special connections to do well in business. This Orban's government, I mean, although it described itself as right wing, and in America we think of right wing as being somehow libertarian or free market, in Hungary, Orban made it very clear from the early days of his rule that his government was a kind of national socialism, without meaning a link to the past, but it was a form of national control. The government would decide who got rich and who didn't. It had a very heavy hand in business and in commerce. And people could see that. And I think the reaction that you saw both in the countryside, but especially in Budapest on the day of the election was partly to that.
Your reporting also documents some of the extremely important work of the remaining brave independent journalists in Hungary in the run-up to the election, including uncovering and exposing a phone conversation that Orban had with Vladimir Putin, in which Orban described himself as a mouse and Putin as a lion. As I mentioned, Orban's office took issue with my reporting all those years ago. My bosses couldn't care less. But that's very hard for journalists in Hungary when the prime minister's office literally targets individual journalists.
Oh yes, no. The journalist who uncovered and exposed that story was accused of being a foreign spy. He had enormous personal pressure put him, but this is nothing unusual for Hungarian journalists. So they are used to being doxxed and harassed. The different Hungarian media at different times were put under financial pressure through the government, through regulation. Government advertising was used as a way to influence media. So favored journals or favored magazines would get lots of advertising from the government or from state companies or from government-run foundations. It's like a huge thumb was pressed on the scale of journalism. And the idea was to frighten or oppress or just make life difficult for really independent journalists and make it much easier for people who were pro-government. And I have to say, one of the really important issues at the end of the campaign was exactly the one that you mentioned, namely the revelation conversations that Orban had with Putin and also with the Hungarian foreign minister had with the Russian foreign minister, in which there seemed to be really colluding. The Hungarian foreign minister is sending EU documents to the Russians, seems to be conferring with them over what kind of Russian sanctions will be applied or will be avoided. And Hungarians who have a memory of Soviet occupation not that long ago, I mean, it's certainly within living memory, and who also remember the Soviet invasion of 1956, became truly offended by these revelations. And one of the things that Hungarians began chanting towards the end of the campaign was "Russians go home," which is a chant from 1956. And to hear younger people chant that, whose grandparents chanted it several decades ago, was really quite remarkable. And I think that was, again, it wasn't the main issue of the campaign, but certainly towards the end, it was very influential.
So, Anne, what's the lesson for America here?
The lesson for America is don't give up, continue fighting illiberalism, and also learn to connect these issues the way that the Hungarian opposition did. So the issue of corruption in the Trump administration is not a separate issue from the things that concern people at home around the kitchen table. The fact that American healthcare is in poor condition is directly related to the fact that there are enormous tax breaks for the very wealthiest Americans. If American politicians, both of the center left and the center right, could begin to connect those things for Americans, I think we would also begin to see our politics take a different shape as well.
And thanks, as always, for your great writing. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer for The Atlantic and the author of numerous books, including Autocracy, Inc.